Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. I wanted to talk today about something that went down on the 4th of December. The Ukrainians used some long-range drones in order to strike a military airfield deep inside of Russia, something that was several hundred kilometers from the border. This is one of those things that, if the war had gone on long enough, was always going to come into play. One of the big misconceptions in the wider world, and in Russia specifically, is that all the intelligentsia of the old Soviet system were Russian, and therefore everyone else was just a subject peoples. There were a lot of things about the Soviet system that were a hot mess. But one of the big social advances they got was actually relatively minimizing the differences in terms of ethnicity of who is a real person and who can get training and who can contribute to society. So, for example, the guy who designed Mir was an ethnic Tatar, and in the case of aerospace, there was a heavy concentration of that industry within Ukraine as opposed to within Russia. And in post-Soviet Ukraine, aerospace design has continued. Now, it might not meet American or Western specifications, but that's as much about protectionism as about skill set differences. And so there's never been this belief anywhere that the Ukrainians didn't know what they were doing when it comes to aerospace. So assuming that they could hold out long enough and assuming they could scrabble together the resources, there was never a doubt that a country that found itself in a position where it needed drones and had to buy them wouldn't be able to make their own. Well, now they have. Here we are, roughly 10 months into the war, and the Ukrainians have put together a long-range drone that has a range of, according to them, about 1,000 miles. They will never be able to put enough of them up to overall change the overall tenor of the war. The Russian military has massive assets throughout the Western Russian space, whether it's recruiting stations or air bases or missile silos, and any weapon that is going to be able to go that far is not going to be able to carry much of a payload. But initial indicators suggest that the payload was in excess of 150 pounds, which is pretty good for a drone. And if the Ukrainians can throw enough of them, they can do some very real damage. Now, we only have 1 day of data to work off of, but right now the Ukrainians are focused on the military assets that are launching bomber attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. So kind of one of those that flies both ways. But we need to start thinking about what it means should the Ukrainians throw a wider net and striking much longer term, because their goal here isn't simply to degrade Russia's military capacity. Their goal is to degrade Russia's military capacity enough so that the Russians have to give in. The Russians have never backed down from a war without losing at least 500,000 men first, and we're probably between 80 and 90,000 right now, so we have a long way to go. And if Ukraine can degrade Russia's economic capacities to fight the war, that's how you prevent the Russians in the mid to long run from rearming in a way that they can throw weapons into Ukrainian urban areas. The easiest way to do that isn't to go after apartment blocks or even power stations, but to target refineries and the nexus points where lots of Russian pipelines come together to a single facility for redistribution. There are a number of refineries throughout the Russian space. We've got a map attached to show you the biggest ones. But the one facility that I want to draw the most attention to is the city of Samara. Samara is a pipeline nexus and refining center for pretty much all of the Russian stuff that comes in from south-central Siberia, as well as in Tatarstan and Bashkiristan, and a lot of the oil projects that the Russians have that are not subject to some of the constraints that they have in the permafrost. If you shut down an oil field in the permafrost, you probably never start it up again because the pipes freeze from the inside. But further south in Bashkiristan and Tatarstan, that's a different picture. It's not permafrost, so the Russians can turn those on and off. But if you remove Samara from the equation, then Russia's ability to be flexible in anything that relates to energy in the fight, and the Ukrainians have done all that deferred maintenance on all that Russian equipment that they've captured, then we're going to see the two of them really go at it. Until then, we're going to have this idea that the Ukrainians are on the front foot, and they are, and that the Russians are reacting poorly and badly, and they are. But while all of that is going on, it's not like the Russians don't have tools. As we started to see a few weeks ago, and as we're going to see more and more intently moving forward, the Ukrainians have the momentum, They're getting more and more gear, and the Russians know that that's not a tide that they can blunt. So what they're trying to do is to destroy the ability of Ukraine to function at all as a country by going after water and power infrastructure, particularly in the dead of winter. The logic being that if they can break the Ukrainians' ability to have a modern society and industry, then the rest of the war really doesn't matter, because the capacity of the Ukrainians to fight and to resist and to advance simply dissolves into nothing, and then the war is over and the Russians just walk in and take over. That's the logic anyway. How it's going to play out in real time is some immense human suffering on a scale we haven't seen yet. And remember, we've already had 1/3 of the Ukrainian population uprooted and displaced or become refugees. So the scale is already pretty big, and the scale of what's coming is going to be even bigger. Several Ukrainian cities have populations over 1 million, and if you remove the support infrastructure that allows you to support a population over 1 million, you no longer have 1 million people living there one way or the other. To that end, Zeihan on Geopolitics, that's the firm that's bringing you all of this, chooses a different charity every few months. Right now we're going with MedShare specifically because of the Ukraine Fund. MedShare provides medical assistance to communities who, for whatever reason, are unable to provide it themselves. So not simply places that need medical assistance, that's a long list. Places that are down on their luck because of factors beyond their control. Places that normally would be able to provide for themselves who just need a helping hand for the moment. To that end, all of our sales from all of our books will be going to MedShare until at least the end of the year, and then we'll of course reassess when we get to January based on how the war is. But to give you an idea of what you're getting into, the first book is The Accidental Superpower. This one's now 10 years old, but it is the first major publication that called for the inevitability of a Russian assault on Ukraine and the why and the how and the where. So solid starting point. Next up is The Absent Superpower. While this is majority an energy book, there is an entire section in it called Russia's Twilight War, which talks about why the Russians are doing what they're doing right now, and why Ukraine is really only the first step in a multi-step military operation. Big facts section on specifically what's going on now in energy markets and what you should expect as the Russian energy output simply falls off the market altogether. Third up, get a little bit more recent here. This one's only 3 years old. This is Disunited Nations. There's a big fat chapter in here on Russia specifically, and explains why the Russians are going to make one last grand grab for empire before the whole system falls apart on them. And then finally, most recently coming out in June, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, where the others are the rise and fall of great nations kind of books. This one's more on the economic after effects. So in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, what happens to global energy? In the aftermath of a Chinese collapse, what happens to global manufacturing and transport? Anyway, all sales, all 4 books until at least the end of the year. I think I'm supposed to say here that they all make great stocking stuffers, but I think it's more accurate to say that these are more I told you so books if you're going to give them as a gift. So keep that in mind. There's going to be pushback. Okay, that's it for me. Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving, and I will see you in December.